Immanuel Kant was one of the most important philosophers of the Enlightenment. He spent his entire life in the Prussian city of Königsberg, rarely travelling far from home, yet his ideas reshaped the way we think about knowledge, morality and freedom. In earlier philosophy, thinkers such as Descartes, Locke and Hume had argued about how knowledge was possible. Descartes, as a rationalist, sought certainty through reason alone. Locke and Hume, as empiricists, argued that knowledge comes from experience. Kant agreed with both in part and argued that knowledge arises when the concepts of reason are applied to experience. His moral philosophy developed this same concern for reason, but applies it to the question of how we ought to act. His fundamental question is, what makes an action morally right? Although moral theories that judge right and wrong by their outcomes were already present in ancient and modern thought, Kant rejects the idea that the morality of an action depends on its consequences. For him, morality is not about producing happiness or good results, but about acting from duty in accordance with reason and a universal moral law. Kant's ethics begins with the concept of the good will. He writes that it is impossible to conceive anything in the world that can be called good without qualification except a good will. The good will does not mean good intentions, warm feelings or benevolence. In Kant's terms, the will acts from pure practical reason for the sake of duty alone. Acting morally is therefore a matter of acting because it is right, not because it is useful, pleasant or advantageous. This is what Kant illustrates with the example of the shopkeeper in his groundwork. A shopkeeper who charges fair prices so that customers return acts in accordance with duty but not from duty. His motive is self-interest, and his action therefore has no moral worth. A shopkeeper who charges fair prices because he recognises it as his duty not to overcharge others acts from duty, and only such an action, done from respect for the moral law, possesses genuine moral worth. The moral worth of an action therefore lies not in what it achieves, but in the principle on which it is done. Kant distinguishes between actions done from inclination, driven by emotion, desire and so on, and actions done from duty, which are governed by reason. Human beings, he says, are rational as well as sensible creatures. We experience emotions or inclinations, but we can also recognise the moral law and act in accordance with it. To act morally is to allow reason to govern inclination. Because this capacity for reason belongs to all rational beings, the moral law therefore applies universally, not only to human beings, but to any rational creature. The principle on which a person acts is called a maxim, the subjective rule or principle of action that that person chooses. Kant distinguishes two kinds of maxims which he calls hypothetical and categorical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives are conditional. They tell us what to do if we will a particular end. For example, if you want to catch the train, you should leave early. Such imperatives depend on desires or goals and are therefore not moral. Categorical imperatives, by contrast, are unconditional. They tell us what we must do simply because we are rational beings, regardless of what we happen to want. Moral obligation for Kant must therefore take the form of a categorical imperative, a command that applies universally, without condition, to all rational agents. Kant gives several formulations of the categorical imperative which express the same fundamental moral law. The first is the formula of universal law. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In other words, act only on principles that could be adopted by everyone without contradiction. A person who makes a false promise when in need cannot will that everyone should do the same, because the very practice of promising would collapse if no one kept promises. Such a rule produces what Kant calls a contradiction in conception. The second is the formula of humanity, sometimes called the formula of ends. Act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. Every rational being, because it can legislate moral law for itself, has absolute worth or dignity. To use someone merely as a means, through deception, coercion or exploitation for example, is to deny that dignity. The third formulation of the categorical imperative is the formula of autonomy. Act so that your will can regard itself at the same time as making universal law through its maxims. Moral laws are not imposed from the outside by God, government or custom, but arise from reason itself. Every rational being is autonomous, capable of giving moral law to itself, and together rational agents form what Kant calls a kingdom of ends, a moral community in which each treats the others as free and equal lawgivers. Kant also distinguishes two ways in which a maxim can fail the test of universalization. A contradiction in conception arises when universalizing the maxim would destroy the very possibility of the action itself, as with false promising. A contradiction in will arises when you could not rationally will the maxim to be universal because it would conflict with your own necessary ends. For example, willing that no one should ever help others would mean you could not will assistance if you yourself needed it. Because we are rational and free, we have autonomy, the capacity to legislate moral law for ourselves through reason. This autonomy is the ground of human dignity. Every person must always be treated as an end in themselves. When we act from duty, guided by the categorical imperative, we respect that dignity in ourselves and in others. Kant's ethics has been enormously influential, but also widely debated. Some question whether moral laws can truly be universal when moral practices vary so widely. Others, such as the utilitarians, object that Kant's refusal to consider consequences leads to implausible results. For example, his claim that it would be wrong to lie, even to save a friend from harm, because lying would violate the moral law and undermine the very possibility of truthfulness. For Kant, however, morality is grounded not in feeling, inclination or outcome, but in reason itself. The only thing good without qualification is a good will, a will that acts purely from duty. From this arise the formulations of the categorical imperative. Act only on principles that could hold universally, treat others as ends in themselves, and regard yourself as a member of a community of rational equals. By grounding morality in rational duty rather than in emotion or consequence, Kant provided a new foundation for ethics, one that continues to shape how we think about right and wrong, freedom and responsibility, and the meaning of acting from reason. Yet there remains substantial tension within his system. To exclude emotion entirely in moral decision-making may risk reducing ethics to something abstract and detached from human life. But Kant's aim was clear, to show that moral obligation comes from the authority of reason itself, and that respect for that authority is what gives human life its moral worth.